you so much for coming to the book fest, and I'm really excited to, moderate this panel, and I hope Jen comes in soon. But just to introduce myself, I am Sunny. I run a YouTube channel called asunnybooknook, and I read a lot of genres. I read every genre and audience, and have a particular focus on like LGBTQ stories and women writers and writers of color. So yeah, if you guys want to introduce yourselves as well, that would be before we get into the questions and stuff. Whoever wants to go first.
I'll go. Hi, Sunny. It's nice to meet you via virtually, and Danny as well. I'm Mariama Lockington. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a middle grade young adult author, educator. I usually am joining virtual panels from where I live in Lexington, Kentucky, but I'm at the American Library Association conference, so I'm joining you from Chicago today. But my debut YA just came out May 23rd, Forever Is Now. And it deals a lot with some of the topics we're going to talk about today. So I'm excited to be here. And yeah, nice to meet you both.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Dannie Olguin. I was actually at the ALA last year, so I'm really super jealous of you and Jen right now that you're there. Between Safe and Real is my debut book. It is a YA about a girl who keeps two diaries. One she knows mom reads, so only safe things are in there. The real diary is where she delves into her real life, which is really difficult. There's some housing insecurity and poverty and abuse, and she's trying to raise her mom and her siblings all at the same time while being 16 and figuring out her sexuality and her identity, and it's a complicated book. So that's my debut, and that's it.
Perfect. So one of the questions that I had prepared, the first one, was that like it seems like with both of your debuts and just with your writing in general, a lot of your work centers on like experiences of queer youth coming of age as a person of color, or as just a young girl, or a woman, like a young woman in a hostile environment, or just like those gendered experiences of like girlhood and such. So I was wondering, like, what are the sort of boundaries that you've maintained or developed in writing these stories for yourself? Because like how a lot of, obviously in writing and in creating a story with like characters that have these like harrowing experiences, they have to draw from like one's life. So I don't know, what's that experience of writing deeply personal stuff and expressions of self, and also like especially when you're writing like young adult fiction and knowing that that's like your audience, and knowing that it is going to serve a purpose in the world as being like a resonating point for young readers. Yeah, I'm curious about that. If you guys want to talk about that.
Do you want to go first, or shall I? Okay. So for me, my writing is always informed by my life, right? I think most of us writers do pull from our lives and figure things out through our writing. So not necessarily that writing is therapy, but it can be very therapeutic. But yeah, you have to have solid boundaries in there. And for me, I was faced with what kind of boundaries, what do those boundaries look like? I was afraid, knowing that there are pieces of my very real self peppered throughout my novel. I was very afraid of blowback from family. I was also trying to break through some of my own personal boundaries that I put on myself. So, for example, in the early drafts of the book, my main character was not she wasn't bi. She had a crush on a boy, but it was all very complicated. But that never sat right with me. It didn't feel she was bi, but I was afraid of the reaction from my partner, from the reaction from my family. Like, I had those personal boundaries. And at a certain point, I had to say, if I'm going to write a story that is as authentic as it can be, I have to be authentic. And I had to blow past those fears, which are a lot like boundaries. But then I also have to create very firm boundaries when I'm writing and drafting, as far as this is my writing time and my writing time is sacred, and like all of that fun stuff. But mostly I think it's about finding the authenticity and the strength to tell the story the way it needs to be told, even if it means standing up against the family system you were raised in. So.
Yeah, I very much relate to that as well. I think my very first book, which is a middle grade, is called For Black Girls Like Me. And it is not a memoir, but it is loosely based on like the emotional core of being a Black girl adopted into a white family. And so I draw on my own life and identities a lot for my books. And those were the types of books that I liked to read growing up, that I was always looking for, was sort of like a reflection of both myself as a queer person, a Black person, an adopted person. And I didn't find a lot of those when I was growing up. And so in many ways, I am writing for young people, but I'm also writing towards sort of the gap that I experienced as a young person looking for reflections of myself on bookshelves. And especially with my first book, I had a lot of blowback and a lot of worry about rocking the boat, because folks don't really like adoptive narratives that are nuanced and don't just focus on one thing. So that was an interesting thing to navigate. And I did have to have really particular boundaries around Q&As about what questions that I was willing to answer or not answer. In my latest book, Forever Is Now, which is a young adult book, it's written in poetry. Poetry is like my core love when it comes to form, or genre, but all my books are kind of hybrid and incorporate poems and prose and other things. I started writing this in May of 2020. So right during height of the beginning of the pandemic. I live in Kentucky, and Breonna Taylor had just been killed by police in Louisville. And I was really struggling with my own anxiety and my own mental health. And this book, I realized I didn't pitch it before, is about a 16-year-old girl growing up in Oakland, California. She's a poet, she's an activist, she's bisexual. And one summer she becomes housebound because of her anxiety. She develops agoraphobia, and just to figure out how to still connect with her community and her family and her beloveds while trying to navigate through a really hard mental health time. And so I wanted to write a book about a Black girl who gets to fall apart and who doesn't have to hold everything up and be okay all the time, or be the stereotypical strong Black woman. And a book that hopefully destigmatizes mental health in the Black community, at the same time focusing on joy and the experience of joy and how that can connect us. So this book is very personal. At the same time, it felt very urgent to write. I think for me, one of my things that I say is I'm not an everyday writer. I'm just not. And I'm also someone who can skip around when I write. And so if there's a particularly hard scene that I need to work on, and I come to the page and I'm just not in a good headspace that day, I will give myself permission to work on another part of the book that's more joyful, maybe, or less intense, so that I can still progress, but I don't have to put myself in a harmful space or a negative space for that particular moment. So I think I need to share my authentic voice. It feels important to me. But yeah, boundaries. I think boundaries with Q&As and how much you share yourself in person with people is important to think through when you write this type of stuff as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think being in like bookish spaces online and stuff, so much of offering your opinion or your reflection on how you personally relate to a book as well in promoting it, or in offering your thoughts on how authentic it feels to your own personal experiences and stuff, can also feel pretty vulnerable, because it's like, even though it's not your own writing, it's like in saying that you really connect to a novelist, or a story, it really reveals something about like your truth and your experiences. And I feel like it must be so much more pressure for the people who are like creating those stories. And I think on that end, I was wondering for Danny if you wanted to talk more about what it was like in terms of like with the boundaries that you were talking about in writing your character to feel like more true to what the story needed, which was that she was bisexual. Was that like something, and you were talking about how that was like a fear that you had in terms of confronting like and also of course with like family storylines and stuff, with confronting family backlash or with your partner and such, like how did, I mean, if like do you want to extend on that if a little, if you want to? I'm just like curious about that, because I feel like when trying to speak to like and as Mariama was saying, like the nuances of a family experience, like that can be really difficult when you know that the people who like want to support you are going to like read your writing. Yeah. Was that sort of like a coming out experience in writing?
Yeah, in a way it was. I grew up in a very religious Mexican family, and it was hard. I knew I was bisexual from a young age, but I was not allowed to ever explore that. I was not allowed to ever talk about that. I was not allowed, it was wrong. And so now, my partner and I have been together for 22 years, and it is a very straight presenting relationship. I'm married to a cis man. And so it was really easy for a long time for me to just sort of deny my bisexuality, because I could just mask, but it was never authentic. The masking was always taking a toll on me. And when it came time to write this book, not only do I explore themes of neglect and abuse and substance abuse, but then to also throw sexuality in there. Even though years ago I went no contact with most of my mother's family, I know that they still kind of keep tabs on me. I know that some of them have read this book, and it was really scary because, yes, it was like me saying, here's this other piece about me that you just never knew. And it was scary. Like, even when you set up boundaries and say, I just can't have contact with X person or Y person, to know that it's going to get back to them, and to know that it may break their heart, it may make them, worry about your eternal soul. Like, I didn't want to do that to them, but I also had to be true to me. So, yeah. Does that help? Hi, Jen. It's good to see you.
Hi. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Sunny, and I run a YouTube channel called asunnybooknook. And thank you so much for your answer, Danny. But thanks for joining us, Jen. If you want to introduce yourself and what your upcoming or current projects are, and yeah.
So sorry, I just had a signing at ALA in Chicago, and I swore this was at 1 p.m. Central Time. So I took a taxi, and now I'm back in my hotel. I'm Jen Ferguson, The Summer of Bitter and Sweet. My next book is called Those Pink Mountain Nights. It comes out in September. And that's what I'm going to give you.
Fair, yeah. I've also been rushed in that regard. Yeah, the first panel question that these two have just answered was talking about like the boundaries between expressing your true self and experiences through your writing, and of course the like very personal things you've been through, and also like your own identity, in order to reach an audience that obviously needs that, especially when you're gearing towards like a young adult or middle grade audience who's like looking for representation and like a trueness in that, but also like having having that distance as a writer, for and like how you've developed or maintained those like over the years in writing, like channeling your personal experiences and then being out in the world essentially.
My first response was like, we're supposed to have boundaries, right? Like, it's really, really hard to write things that have deep emotion behind them without putting a large chunk of yourself into it. And the longer I've been writing fiction, the more I've learned how to do that. And still, if I'm going to write a story and I want it to have an emotional core, I feel like I have to dig into the thing that I know most, which is my experience of being out in the world. So I'm sure there are authors who are further along in their publishing journey who are like, I've learned how to take care of myself after I've done that. I'm not sure I'm there yet. I'm not sure I've figured out how to be giving teenagers what I want to give them. I just stood in a signing line and talked to so many librarians who were like, my kids love your book. They need this book. It doesn't stay on the shelf. There's not enough demi-rep in the world. So like, that's what I'm doing it for. And that matters enough that I'm willing to give those parts of myself, even though I finish writing a book and I think I can't do this again. So I don't know. I want someone who's got 20 years experience doing this to come in and be like, these are the things I've done, and these are my boundaries, and these are the ways that I've managed to remain authentic and tell stories that have an emotional core. But it's not me yet. I don't have the answer to that one yet.
No, yeah, that totally makes sense. I liked what Mariama was saying previously about just in terms of the Q&As and being on panels and stuff, how she was saying like especially because her first middle grade novel was dealing with being a like transracial adoptee situation, like how some of the questions and stuff that came up were at like book talks were she just sort of had to set boundaries with that. And yeah, Mariama, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I think, Jen, what you're saying, also I'm at ALA too, about to go to a signing, so hi. I think that what you're saying about like as far as boundaries approaching the page is really real. I also don't know if I've mastered that yet, but what I did do a lot of practice on is because my first book was so much about my experience growing up as a transracial adoptee, and because it's really complicated to talk to white adoptive parents. As a transracial adoptee, I knew that I was going to get a lot of probing questions or people looking for validation or answers. And so something that I prepared myself for with that book, and that's helped me with other book, is like answering the question I want to answer when I'm asked something. And then also being fine saying, that, thank you for that question, but that's not something I'm ready to talk about. I get a lot of questions about like, do you know your biological family? And depending on the audience, I usually don't answer that question and just say that's a really personal thing for an adoptee. And, I'll share it with who I want to. So just that. And so not shutting people down, but also having boundaries with like what I share, even if what I share on the page is coming from that emotional core and that emotional experience. So, it also depends on the audience and how safe I'm feeling. And so that I think is a big thing too. But I don't know. Like I said, like this current book is like my anxiety pandemic book about chronic anxiety and queerness and community and activism. And a lot of things that were happening around and to me at the time really informed it. And so I don't know if I wrote it with boundaries, but a lot of young people, like you've said, Jen, have said that it's been already a really important book. It's only been out for a month, and that's what I do it for, I feel like. So.
Yeah, that's really special. And that kind of brings me to the other question that I had prepared, which is like, especially with how difficult the world is, like, and Mariama was talking about as well, starting writing her book in like May of 2020 and being in Kentucky right after Breonna Taylor had just been murdered, and trying to convey a story with like similar themes at like the center of that, and being like agoraphobic and not going outside. I'm like, I wonder, you know, especially for the audience that like y'all are writing for a lot of people who are, you know, like queer young kids. Like I was in high school within the past 5 years of my life, so like I remember reading a lot of like what felt like to me at the time, and what I know to be is like really personal fiction from authors, and that really like resonated with me as well, and like made me feel like really seen and safe. And so I don't know, as writers, like how does it feel to be, and how is it to exist in the world and to know that like your work and that your role is to like in some ways make the world like a safer and more inhabitable space for like young people? And you know, like what does that look like for you in your approach? And yeah.
So, as my day job, I teach at a private liberal arts college in Iowa. And Iowa is sort of like right behind Florida, being really, really, really problematic in a lot of ways. And I realized that most of my students are queer and trans students. They're almost all white. But they must have thought this school was like the safe place to go to. So I feel like in my day job, I'm doing a lot of that. But I'm doing that stuff where you have to be with someone. And as writers, we don't usually get to be with our readers when they're in that intimate moment. And I kind of love that. Like, I love that the book is supposed to be something that you maybe consume by yourself and then go to other people to talk about. But part of why I'm a writer is that I feel like that power and that safe space is in the book. And then I don't have to do more work than that. Like I have done the work, and then it is up to the reader to take that work on its next step. And I find that really fulfilling. I find my day job really fulfilling too, but you know, that's a lot of emotional labor. And we get to do the emotional labor like in the writing, and then we get to pass off the experience to someone else. And I find that fits who I am and fits the amount of work I can do. I can write the book, and then I can meet you at a convention and shake your hand and like sign your book and talk to you for 30 seconds. And like, that's it, unless we're talking about teens. And you know, if your audience are teens, I can do more of that work, and I'm willing to do more of that work.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. And it is really real that, and I feel like having, with the question of like boundaries again, having that relationship with like an audience that knows that, and I think especially in like the book like influencing and reviewing space as well, the line, but like understanding that like book reviewers and like authors exist in like different capacities and for different purposes, and also of course like the viewers of that and readers who are often the same group, like who are the same people, like they also come to these with different, and the only reason why I make like YouTube videos and stuff about books in the first place is because I watched so many of them growing up to get recommendations, because I read so voraciously, and existing in that role now because I grew up with that is like interesting, because of how when you put like something into the world, and then when I consume like a book, I don't expect an author to like carry me beyond that, because what is already there is so much of that's what I needed, and that's sort of it. But yeah, whoever wants to talk next.
I mean, Jen, I loved what you said about like creating a safe space within the book, and then it's out there for, you know, readers and others to find and pass on. And I think that's very, very true. I also work in education for my day job. I work for higher ed now, but I've worked in like youth nonprofit spaces. And so I find my work writing for young people, and then the work that I do to create like safe classrooms and a space for students to share their stories is really important, and sort of how I do that work or attempt to. Um, One of my favorite things, though, this is my first young adult book. So my past 2 books have been middle grade. And with middle grade, you do a lot of school visits. And that is honestly so joyful every single time, because it's this opportunity. Like, I have written this book, I have done all this emotional labor, and then it's just out there. And sometimes it can be very hard to like tell what's going on, like, how people are responding to it. And then you go to these school visits, and you get a group of, teens or tweens that has like read the book thoroughly and have just all these amazing questions for you. Some related to the book, just some like putting you in the hot seat, like, what is your astrological sign and your wife's astrological sign, which was one of my most recent favorite questions. Um, I was like, are you going to do our full charts, here in this class, or maybe? So that for me is also part of the work, and part of like reminding me when I am in that solitary moment at the computer, or trying to, gaslight myself into thinking like, wow, how could I write a book? I don't know how to do this. That's the thing where I'm like, nope, keep pushing ahead, because you get these really validating moments where you understand how your books are impacting or creating a space for young people to be who they are. And that for me is like, when I need my cup filled, those moments really help me get back to then the work of just writing the book.
So my book is from like a smaller publisher, and it's a very niche topic. So I don't do school visits. I don't have long lines of people who want to meet me, but what I do get is the occasional email or message from somebody who says, "Oh my gosh, I did not know other people went through similar things, and for the first time I feel so seen." And that's kind of why I wrote this book. It's because I graduated high school in the 90s. That was a long, long time ago. And back then, there was nothing that represented my life on the shelves. There was nothing. I had the Babysitter's Club, I had Sweet Valley High, I had some really classic books, but none of them showed what it was like to come from really hard circumstances and have to make really hard decisions. And so I realized as an adult, that's the kind of book I consume now. Like, I want to voraciously read YA in middle grade that has to deal with these hard topics, because it's sort of retroactively healing my inner child. When I'm consuming that stuff, it's validating my own experiences. And then I know that what I've put out there is adding to the library that children now and in the future will have to draw on to help validate their experiences. So like, that's how I get my like little boost of and then another thing that I really try to do to make the world a better, more inclusive place, I vote in every election. Every election. And I volunteer as much as I can in every aspect that I can. If I do consider myself an activist, and if we're not intersectional with our activism, we're not there at all. So that's also really important. We have to create the world we want our children to grow up in. And my generation, we left you guys and younger generations with a lot to clean up, and I'm very sad about that, and I'm trying to fix it. So
yeah, I think in my public high school was so, and my library at said high school was so fantastic, because our budget and our librarians and our like English department was so intentional about bringing in as many like YA authors as possible to do Q&As and talks and panels and such. And they brought in like a lot of cool people, like who's the person who wrote Darius is Not Okay, and
Adib
also
Saram.
Yes, Adu Karam. He came, as well as oh gosh, another YA novelist who writes her work in verse. Like, just a lot of cool people. But I remember like being in high school and reading like Elizabeth of Acevedo for the first time and being like, there's just something like so like it was just such a gift to exist in like the 2010s publishing space as a reader, because when I was in like middle school reading middle grade and stuff, like the more speculative fantasy things and the like way that they portrayed the hardships of like being a kid and growing up versus like the more realism sort of grounded, like this, what is it like to be like a girl of color with like a difficult relationship with her mom, like that more that kind of thing was just some, it was like reading that crying in the library type of situation. And I think like that having that experience as like a young person in recent memory is just so special, and like that's why I was really curious to have like the perspective on the other side of that as people who create the and have know with the intention and know that that's the audience and that's what and I think like the other question that I had prepared, and this is the last one, so like we can, and we have another like 15 minutes, I think, so we can talk about other things as well. But I was also, curious to know how, like, writing your own experiences and having that be like your work, and having and sharing that with the world being so intrinsic to the work, how does that help you like come to terms with your own like growth and the difficulties you face personally? And like, is that because you guys are just talking about how it's therapeutic as well, but yeah, like how is writing part of that process, I guess?
Okay, I can go first. If anybody else wants to jump in, please do. I don't want to. Okay, so I'm not okay. I'm a freaking train wreck all the time. Really, it is scary. It is scary to put yourself out there like that. It is scary to write the things that are so deep inside you, you never even had words for them until you put them on paper. But it's interesting for me that the more I do it, the more I realize that my perspectives shift and change. And I do tend to write a lot about complicated parental relationships. I write a lot about sibling love, and I write a lot about found family. Those are my three big themes that are always in my books. And I realize that through my writing, there is nothing I could have ever done differently to change the outcome of my childhood and my brother's childhood. But I can imagine different outcomes through my writing. And that's kind of therapeutic. And knowing, it goes back again to knowing that the readers will see my words and maybe feel a little more connected, maybe feel a little less alone, maybe feel a little hopeful for the first time. That makes it so worth it to go through the hard parts. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I start writing a scene and then I just back away from it completely. And I think, no, this is too much. This is too personal. Nobody's going to want to read this. Nobody's going to believe it. But then you come back to it and I realize it needs to be there, because without the authenticity, the representation isn't really representation. So I don't know. I don't even think I answered that question, but that's what I got.
No, that's perfect. That makes sense. Like, you you have to like express yourself in order to do what like like needs to be done and conveyed. Yeah, does Jen or Mariama want to speak to this next?
So I came out to my parents by handing them an arc of The Summer of Bitter and Sweet, and like the liberal or repressed Canadians we are, we've never spoken about it again, which is lovely. I'm totally okay with this. But I had to write that book and finish it before I felt like that was something I cared to share with my family. In the same way that I gave my dad an arc 2 weeks ago of my next book, and like, yeah, yay, I have depression. Great. So for me, I realized maybe I should stop writing books and handing them to my parents, and I could just tell my parents things instead of like having to write a whole book and publish it before I can tell them something. That's on me. But there is something that helps me to heal and allows me to keep writing in putting hard things on the page, because then I get to, like Danny said it, you get to imagine your way out of it in a way that maybe you didn't get to get out of it when you were a teenager. And then the other thing I'm thinking a lot about is I struggle with hope as a human. And I realized that writing books for teenagers is my hopeful gesture. Like that is how I put hope into the world. It's in these books. And while there are heavy topics, I had some librarians who came up to me who'd read my second book, and they were like, it was so good. And I was like, do you need a hug? And they were like, yeah. Right. So like, things are always going to be heavy in my books. I tried to write a cute summer rom-com, and it turned into The Summer of Bitter and Sweet. Like I tried and it didn't work. So I promise that it's a hopeful gesture, though. That's what I am offering you is to go through the thing and to come out the other side of the thing. And that's something I need to learn and internalize myself, right? That you can go through the thing and you can still have moments where you laugh your butt off with your friends, right? Like you can still have those moments even in the heavy times. So also thinking about intentionally writing those moments into my books, moments where teens just get to be teens.
Yeah, there's so much I could echo from both of you. I think, Danny, I just want to echo and affirm that I'm also a mess all the time and a constant work in progress and figuring things out. And when I said I gaslight myself at every project, I do. I love writing. I love storytelling. I've been doing it since I was young, but every project I start to second guess myself around like, do you really have any authority on this? Does anyone want to hear this? Like, can you write? So that's, my own thing to get through and work through. And I do that. But my story is similarly, and I love this panel so much because when I was young, I wanted books about the messiness of growing up. I wasn't a big fantasy reader, probably because I couldn't see myself. And now as an adult, I'm reading a lot more young adult fantasy and different genres. But I wanted to read books about like contemporary kids in the here and now going through some tough things. Because I was a young person who was growing up with a lot of privilege in some ways. But as a Black adoptee, transracial adoptee, I was also growing up with a lot of grief, a lot of big questions, a lot of anxiety, depression, and loneliness around not knowing where I was from, not seeing people who looked like me. And that experience was very isolating. And so it really is just so frustrating that right now in this time of book banning, not all, but a lot of adults are like, kids can't handle the tough topics and it's like completely the opposite of when I talk to young people of, fifth graders through like 10th, 12th graders, completely the opposite of like what is going on in their lives, regardless if they've read my book or not. And I don't think we give young people enough credit for the amount of stuff that they are holding. And I think all my books are going to have quote unquote tough topics in them, but also moments of joy and friendship and community. And I think that that's like the biggest thing I usually tell people is I want young people to remember that two things can be true at the same time, and that you can feel more than one thing at the same time. So like in one moment you can feel really isolated, sad, depressed, and then in the next moment you can be laughing because you connected with your best friend over something, and that's important too. And you don't have to separate and always be happy or all, and so hopefully trying to provide some nuance within my stories, because that's what I really needed and still need, is this understanding that sometimes you have a parent and you can love them from a distance, but you cannot love them and be in their lives. And that's okay. And so providing stories that complicate relationships, that complicate experiences, and that validate that young people are both, having a great time in some ways and also really struggling, is sort of where I live in the books that, I have like a big TBR of books from all of you and writers that are writing for young people now that I'm like, oh my God, this book would have been just like a breath of fresh air as a young person who really struggled in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's kind of what I hope to do. I don't know, I forget the question, but so much of the same of everyone. I love this panel and the books that we write, because it's very much where I live.
I think you just unlocked why I read all those Lurleen McDaniel books about teenagers who are dying. They're all like white girls who are dying, who've never kissed a boy yet, right? And I consumed every single one of those, but I was seeking the messiness. I was seeking someone who was going through a really hard time. And even though that wasn't my hard time, I consumed those. I just devoured every single one of them. And it's the same plot in every single book, but I needed that.
Yeah. I loved books about orphans. I wonder why. And I also loved books, like I loved the Gary Paulson books about kids who like get lost in the wilderness and have to figure out how to survive, or boxcar children. And like as an adult, I was like, why did I love those books so more? And it's because they're isolated. They're not with family. They're figuring out how to survive. And even though I'm not a white boy who got like stranded in the, in the woods in the Pacific Northwest, like there was something about the isolation and loneliness and just having to figure things out on your own that I responded to as a young person. So same. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like there's an audience question that, sorry, the AC just came on. So, but one of the audience questions is that, like, what do you hope readers take away from your books?
Okay, I'll go. So I talked about a little bit the three themes that I always have in my books: complicated family relationships, sibling love, found family. Those are always the three big ones. And I think regardless of whatever project I'm working on, but especially true for Between Safe and Real, what I want people to take away from the book is that family is what you make it, not necessarily what you're born into. You can choose your family, and you can choose to remove yourself from family if they are not safe for you to be around. What I want people to really take away from my books is that they can be empowered to make the choices that are very best for them, regardless of the fear and the difficulty of making that choice.
Yeah, I think in general, I want young people to understand that being a young person is messy. That's okay. Being an adult is messy, and that's okay. That more than one thing is true at the same time, like I said, and validating that we can feel lots of feelings at the same time. I think for Forever Is Now in particular, wanting to validate that it's okay not to be okay, and especially with the last like 3-4 years we've had, but just wherever you are, however you're coming into the world, it's okay if you haven't got it figured out yet. And that joy can be something to reclaim and hold on to, and connect us in moments of darkness and moments where we feel really adrift. And so this book is as much about, struggling with chronic anxiety and that messiness of being a teen, but it is also as much about like, well, how do I reclaim joy and stay connected to my chosen family, my family, and the people who help me feel alive. And so that's what I'm hoping people take away from Forever's now.
I guess if it's a teenager, I want them to take whatever they need. And I feel like I put a lot of things in my books. So like you can pick up the thing you need and you can take that with you, but you don't have to take all the things. Take the ones you need. For adults who read YA, and particularly who are reading my books, I guess I want them to think about how just because you're an adult doesn't mean you should stop changing and learning and becoming, and that it's important to think about how difficult life is now for teenagers. It was not this difficult when I was a teenager, and it certainly wasn't when my parents were, in a lot of ways. So like maybe start to empathize a little bit more with the people who are coming up behind us, and maybe do some things to help them, and or like learn a truth about the world you didn't learn when you were growing up that you still need to learn. Take that with you, please, and thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I think we have like a few minutes left, but this was such a great talk and panel. I'm glad you guys came, and I learned a lot from y'all's perspectives. And is there anything like that you feel like you want to say that hasn't been said yet?
I am never late to anything, and I feel so bad about that. So big apologies to everyone. This is not me.
Oh, no worries.
I just will say Happy Pride Month.
Yes, happy Pride. Yay. Is anyone going to Pride events this weekend or anything?
It's
Sunday
think-
in Chicago.
Chicago Pride is tomorrow. The parade is. I think there was a whole festival previously. Yeah.
I live in Arizona, and I think we usually do Pride in October because it's ridiculously hot out here. Like we usually walk our dog during the summer. We have to walk her at 5 a.m. because once the sun comes up, this ground's too hot for her feet. So no, I'm not leaving my house if I don't have to.
That's real. Well, I don't know if Sonora's gonna.
Sunny,
Come
thank you
back.
for your questions. They were really thoughtful.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Hi, Sonora. I can't see or hear you. Oh, they disappeared. Okay.
Thank you. This was lots of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's
Nice to meet you all.
It's
Say
nice
hi
meeting you.
in person when we run into each other.
Yes.
Yeah. And y'all are both at the same event. That's so cool.
I
Bye.
hope you guys